In the annals of Western legend, there are names that make even the most hardened outlaws pause. Wild Bill Hickok, John Wesley Hardin, the infamous Billy the Kid. But perhaps none struck more fear into the black hearts of evil men than the mysterious Iron Gunner, a phantom of justice whose true identity remained hidden for years. Some say he could shoot a running jackrabbit at 100 yards with his custom-forged revolvers. Others swear he once took down 15 bandits in a shootout that lasted less than 30 seconds. But the truth about the Iron Gunner, like many legends of the West, began with a simple man and an extraordinary talent. Join me today as we delve into the remarkable tale of Thomas "Quiet Tom" Sullivan, the unassuming blacksmith whose gentle hands could forge both the finest steel and deliver the deadliest justice the frontier had ever seen. If this story touches your soul, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's tale will shake you to your very core. Millstone Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. The town wasn't much to look at. A dusty main street lined with wooden buildings weathered by harsh winters and scorching summers, where hope and desperation danced together in the shadow of the Medicine Bow Mountains. Most folks knew Thomas Sullivan as the town's blacksmith, a bear of a man with shoulders broad as an ox and hands that could bend iron to his will. His shop sat at the edge of town, the rhythmic ring of his hammer against steel as constant as a church bell. Those who brought their horses to be shod or their tools to be mended found Sullivan to be a man of few words, his responses rarely stretching beyond a simple nod or quiet, "Yes, ma'am," or "No, sir." The local children would gather at his shop window, watching in wonder as he transformed raw metal into everything from horseshoes to cooking pots, his movements precise and deliberate, each strike of his hammer purposeful as a surgeon's scalpel. "Never seen hands that steady," Martha Webb, the owner of the general store, would often say. Man could probably thread a needle in the dark. She didn't know how right she was, though not in the way she imagined. Sheriff James Cooper, a veteran lawman who'd seen his share of killers and criminals, often found himself studying Sullivan during his regular visits to have his horse shod. There was something about the blacksmith's eyes that caught his attention, a watchfulness that seemed at odds with his peaceful profession. Two kinds of quiet men in this territory, Cooper would later write in his journal, those who've got nothing worth saying and those who've seen too much to speak of. Sullivan struck me as the latter. The truth about Thomas Sullivan lay buried beneath years of careful silence, hidden like the steel core of a well-forged blade. Before he was Quiet Tom, the blacksmith, he'd been known by another name in the New Mexico Territory, the Iron Gunner, a legend who'd appeared seemingly out of nowhere during the bloodiest years of the Lincoln County War. His custom-forged revolvers, crafted by his own hands, were said to never jam, never miss fire, and never miss their mark. But that was before the tragedy at Bitter Creek, before he'd laid down his guns and picked up his blacksmith's hammer, seeking peace in honest work and quiet days. For 5 years, he'd managed to keep his past buried, building a new life strike by strike, forge by forge, until the day the Hawkins gang rode into Millstone Creek. They came at noon, when the summer sun hung high and hot in the Wyoming sky. 6 riders, trail-worn and dangerous, their horses kicking up dust clouds that drifted down Main Street like prairie smoke. At their head rode Marcus Hawkins himself, a man whose reputation for cruelty had spread across 3 territories. Behind him, his younger brothers Luke and Matthew flanked a wagon they'd stolen 2 towns over, along with 3 hired guns whose names would be forgotten by history. As the gang tied their horses outside the saloon, Thomas Sullivan stood in the doorway of his shop, his leather apron still tied around his waist, watching with eyes that missed nothing. He saw how they positioned themselves, noted the way they carried their weapons, recognized the predatory swagger in their stride. His right hand, calloused from years of metalwork, unconsciously flexed, an old reflex he thought he'd buried along with his guns. The peace of Millstone Creek was about to be shattered, and with it, the quiet life Thomas Sullivan had built for himself. What the Hawkins gang couldn't know was that they weren't just riding into another defenseless town. They were walking into the den of a legend they thought was dead. And some legends, like the steel Sullivan forged, only grow stronger when tested by fire. The hammer on Sullivan's anvil fell silent for the first time that day, its echo replaced by a tension thick as forge smoke. The story of the iron gunner was about to be rewritten, one bullet at a time. Marcus Hawkins wasn't a man who believed in subtlety. His first order of business in Millstone Creek was to announce his presence with all the delicacy of a mountain lion in a chicken coop. The saloon's bat-wing doors crashed open under his boot, the afternoon crowd falling silent as he and his brothers swaggered in. Behind them, their 3 hired guns, Cole Barrett, Snake-Eye Jenkins, and a Mexican pistolero known only as El Coyote, spread out with practiced efficiency. "Afternoon, folks," Hawkins called out, his voice carrying the kind of false cheerfulness that preceded violence like thunder before a storm. "My brothers and I are feeling mighty thirsty after our long ride. Figure it's only neighborly for everyone here to buy us around." His hand rested casually on his gun belt, the well-worn Colt at his hip speaking louder than words. From his shop across the street, Sullivan watched through his window as several townsfolk hurried out the saloon's back door. His practiced eye noted every detail. How Luke Hawkins favored his left side, probably nursing a wound. How Matthew's gun belt was new, but his draw had already worn a distinctive pattern in the leather. How El Coyote's eyes constantly scanned the room, marking exits and threats with professional precision. Martha Webb hurried into his shop, her face pinched with worry. "Tom, Sheriff Cooper's out checking on that ranch dispute in the South Valley. Won't be back till sundown." She wrung her hands in her apron. "These men, I've heard stories. They burned half of Silver Springs last month, killed anyone who stood against them." Sullivan nodded slowly, his massive hands still working the bellows of his forge. The fire's glow caught the scars on his forearms, old wounds that told stories he'd never shared. "Best get home, Miss Martha," he said softly. "Lock your doors." But Martha lingered, watching as he pulled a glowing length of steel from the fire. "What about you, Tom? Maybe you should close up shop, at least until the sheriff returns." The ghost of a smile touched Sullivan's lips as he hammered the red-hot metal. Each strike rang out clear and true, like a church bell tolling the hours. "Got work to finish," he replied. "Mr. Peterson needs his plow blade by morning." What he didn't tell her was that the blade on his anvil wasn't for any plow. His trained hands, which had once crafted the most reliable guns in the territory, were forging something else entirely, something that sang with the memory of older, darker days. In the saloon, the Hawkins gang had already started making themselves at home. Luke Hawkins, the youngest of the brothers, was deep in his cups, regaling the terrified bartender with tales of their recent exploits. "Should have seen what we did to that marshal in Apache Wells," he slurred. "Thought he was tough till Marcus showed him what real tough looks like." Matthew Hawkins, always the calculating one, was studying a map spread across a corner table, marking locations with methodical precision. Their stolen wagon wasn't just filled with random plunder. They were working their way through the territory systematically, targeting specific towns for specific reasons. El Coyote appeared at Marcus's shoulder, speaking in low tones. "Jefe, this town's richer than it looks. The bank's been holding cattle money from the spring drives. Word is the payroll for the new railroad spur is coming through next week." Marcus Hawkins grinned, the expression never reaching his cold eyes. "Looks like we might be staying in Millstone Creek a while, boys. Might even need to set up something more, permanent." He raised his voice, addressing the cowed saloon patrons. "You folks don't mind having some new neighbors, do you?" The answering silence was broken only by the steady ring of Sullivan's hammer from across the street. Each strike seemed to echo with purpose now, like a clock counting down to something inevitable. In his shop, Sullivan worked with the patience of a man who understood timing, both in the forging of steel and the delivery of justice. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Millstone Creek's main street, more riders began arriving in town, hard men answering Hawkins's call, drawn by the promise of easy pickings and blood money. What they couldn't know was that with each passing hour, with each ring of that blacksmith's hammer, they were helping to resurrect a legend they'd been fortunate enough to never meet. The iron gunner was about to ride again, and this time he had home ground advantage. If you're enjoying this tale of hidden legends and frontier justice, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Now let's return to Millstone Creek, where darkness was falling and dangers were rising. The sun was setting over the Medicine Bow Mountains, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, when Sheriff James Cooper's horse came thundering down Main Street. He'd heard about the Hawkins gang's arrival from a terrified ranch hand who'd passed him on the road. The aging lawman's face was grim as he reined up in front of his office, his deputy, young Billy Hawthorne, hurrying out to meet him. "How many?" Cooper demanded, swinging down from his saddle. "Started with 6, Billy reported, his voice tight with tension. "But more have been riding in steady since noon, counting at least 15 now, maybe more. They've taken over the saloon, sir, and Marcus Hawkins has been suggesting that folks might want to contribute to their welcome party." Cooper's weathered hand rested on his gun belt, fingers drumming thoughtfully against the worn leather. "Any trouble yet?" "Not exactly, but—" Billy hesitated, glancing down the street where Sullivan's forge still glowed like a demon's eye in the gathering dusk. "Luke Hawkins and a couple of their boys went to the blacksmith shop about an hour ago. Said they needed some work done." In his shop, Sullivan stood calmly before his anvil, watching as Luke Hawkins and 2 of the gang's newer recruits swaggered around his workspace. The younger Hawkins was drunk enough to be dangerous, picking up tools and tossing them aside with casual disregard. "Heard you're the best smithy in 3 territories," Luke slurred, running a finger along the edge of a newly forged knife on Sullivan's workbench. "My brother Marcus, he appreciates quality work. Thinks you might be useful to have around." Sullivan's response was characteristically brief. "Got all the work I need." Snake-Eye Jenkins, living up to his name with a lazy left eye that never quite focused, picked up a horseshoe from the cooling bucket. "Ain't about what you need, Smith. Boss man's offering you protection. Shame if something were to happen to this nice setup you got here." Sullivan's massive hands, still grimy from the forge, closed slowly into fists. For a moment, something flickered in his eyes. Something old and dangerous that made even the drunk Luke Hawkins take an instinctive step back. But when Sullivan spoke, his voice remained quiet as ever. "Nothing here needs protecting." That's when Luke Hawkins made his first real mistake. Angry at being subtly challenged, he grabbed one of Sullivan's finest hammers and hurled it into the forge. "Maybe you ain't hearing so good, old man. This ain't a request." The hammer's handle caught fire, flames licking at the fine wood Sullivan had carefully shaped. He watched it burn, his face unreadable, but those who knew him well might have noticed how still he'd become, like the calm before a prairie storm. Across the street, Sheriff Cooper emerged from his office just in time to see Marcus Hawkins himself heading toward the blacksmith shop, Matthew and El Coyote flanking him like shadows. The lawman's hand tightened on his gun belt, but Billy caught his arm. "Boss, we can't take on the whole gang, not with just the 2 of us." Cooper's eyes narrowed as he watched the scene unfold. "Sometimes, son, the most dangerous man isn't the one making all the noise." In his shop, Sullivan reached slowly into the forge with his tongs, retrieving the burning hammer. The flames cast strange shadows across his face as he examined the ruined tool. When he finally looked up at Luke Hawkins, the drunk outlaw felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "That was my father's hammer," Sullivan said softly, each word falling like a hammer strike on hot steel. "Had it since I was a boy." Luke started to laugh, but the sound died in his throat as Marcus Hawkins stepped into the shop. The gang leader took in the scene with sharp eyes, noting his brother's drunken swagger, the burning hammer, and most importantly, the way Sullivan held himself. The kind of stillness that spoke volumes to a man who'd survived as long as Marcus had. As night settled over Millstone Creek, 2 kinds of darkness gathered: the natural shadow of evening and the deeper shadow of violence yet to come. In his office, Sheriff Cooper began loading his rifle, knowing that come morning, something would have to give. What he couldn't know was that Thomas Sullivan was already preparing for a very different kind of dawn, one that would remind the territory why they once whispered the name of the Iron Gunner in fear and awe. Marcus Hawkins had survived 20 years of frontier violence by learning to read men like others. Red wanted posters. Standing in Sullivan's workshop, watching the blacksmith hold that burning hammer, something tickled at the edge of his memory. A story he'd heard years ago in a New Mexico saloon about a gunsmith whose weapons were worth more than gold and whose aim was worth even more. "My apologies for my brother's behavior," Marcus said smoothly, shooting Luke a glare that promised future consequences. "We'll pay for the hammer, of course, and any other tools that need replacing." He studied Sullivan's face carefully, looking for any reaction. Always believed a man's tools are sacred as his guns. Sullivan's expression remained unchanged as he plunged the ruined hammer into the cooling barrel, steam hissing like angry snakes. Some things can't be replaced with money. Matthew Hawkins, ever the observer, noticed something odd about the workshop's layout. Most smithies he'd seen were cluttered, tools scattered wherever convenient. But Sullivan's shop was organized with military precision, everything within easy reach, clear paths to every exit. Even the placement of the forge seemed tactical, offering cover while maintaining sightlines to both doors. "Interesting setup you got here," Matthew commented, earning a sharp look from his older brother. "Almost like you're expecting trouble." El Coyote, who'd killed his first man in a Sonora gunfight at 16, felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. Something about the blacksmith's stillness reminded him of a jaguar he'd once seen in the mountains. Not the nervous tension of prey, but the deadly patience of a predator. "Just practical," Sullivan replied, turning back to his forge. The flames painted his scarred forearms in shades of orange and red, highlighting old wounds that spoke of more than just smithing accidents. Man needs to know where his tools are. Marcus decided to change tactics. "Truth is, Mr. Sullivan, we came to offer you an opportunity. Town like this growing every day, railroad coming through. Man of your skills could profit from some organization. Protection, supplies, guaranteed customers." His smile was practiced, professional. "All we'd need in return is some specialized work now and then." Sullivan's hammer fell on the anvil, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the enclosed space. Luke, still drunk but not stupid, flinched. "What kind of specialized work?" Sullivan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew. "Heard you can work wonders with gunmetal," Marcus replied. "Maybe even improve on standard designs. Man with that kind of skill shouldn't waste his time on horseshoes and plow blades." In his office across the street, Sheriff Cooper was writing in his journal, a habit he'd maintained through 20 years of law work. "Saw something strange today," he wrote. When Marcus Hawkins walked into Sullivan's shop, the blacksmith's hands never stopped working but his eyes. I've seen that look before in '68 during the Lincoln County troubles. There was a man then, never caught his name, who could shoot the flame off a candle at 50 paces with guns he'd forged himself. They called him the Iron Gunner. Back in the workshop, Marcus was still talking, laying out his vision of their future partnership. Sullivan let him speak, his hammer falling in steady rhythm, each strike marking time like a courthouse clock counting down to judgment. Finally, Marcus ran out of words. "Well," the gang leader prompted, "what do you say to our offer?" Sullivan set down his hammer with deliberate care. When he turned to face them, the forge fire behind him cast his shadow long across the workshop floor. "Not interested." Luke, his drunken courage restored by his brother's presence, spat on the floor. "Ain't smart. Turning down Marcus's generosity. Bad things happen to folks who don't see which way the wind's blowing." "That a threat?" Sullivan asked softly, and something in his voice made even Marcus Hawkins take half a step back. "Just a friendly warning," Marcus recovered quickly. "Town's changing, Mr. Sullivan. Best be on the right side of that change." He gestured to his men. "Let's go. Give our friend here some time to think it over." As they left, Matthew Hawkins glanced back one last time. Sullivan had returned to his work, but now his hammer strikes seemed different, more purposeful, like a man working to a deadline only he could see. In the deepening night, the forge's glow painted the blacksmith's shadow on the wall, and for just a moment Matthew could have sworn that shadow held a gun instead of a hammer. Before we dive back into our tale, if you're finding yourself drawn into this story of hidden legends and simmering vengeance, make sure to subscribe. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Dawn broke over Millstone Creek like a fever, the summer sun already promising another scorching day. Martha Webb was opening her store early when she noticed something odd. Thomas Sullivan's forge hadn't yet been lit. In 5 years, she'd never known him to start late. The blacksmith shop stood dark and quiet, smoke-stained windows revealing nothing of what lay within. At the saloon, now effectively the Hawkins gang's headquarters, Marcus was holding court over breakfast, planning the day's business. His men had spent the night drinking and boasting, but now they nursed hangovers with coffee and whiskey, while their leader laid out his vision for Millstone Creek's future. "Town's got money," Marcus explained, pointing to locations on a crude map spread across the table. "Bank, railroad payroll coming, all those cattle drives passing through. Just needs proper management." He looked up at his gathered men. "First order of business, make sure everyone understands their new obligations. Start with the small shops, work our way up." Luke Hawkins, still pale from the previous night's excesses, raised his hand. "What about the blacksmith?" Marcus's face darkened. "Leave Sullivan to me. I'll either see reason or—" He left the threat hanging, but everyone understood. In the territories, accidents happened all the time. Forges exploded, workshops burned. Sheriff Cooper, watching the saloon from his office window, saw riders heading out in pairs, collection crews starting their morning rounds of intimidation. His deputy, Billy, was practically vibrating with nervous energy. "We can't just let them take over the town," Billy protested. "Should send for help from the territorial marshal." "Takes 3 days for a marshal to get here," Cooper replied grimly. "Town might not have 3 days." He checked his rifle for the 4th time that morning. Sometimes help comes from unexpected places. Back at Sullivan's shop, the door remained closed, but sounds had begun emerging. Not the familiar ring of hammer on anvil, but something else. Metal sliding against metal, the subtle click of mechanisms being tested, the whisper of steel being honed to lethal sharpness. Inside, Thomas Sullivan worked in the pre-dawn gloom, his massive hands moving with surgical precision over an array of items spread across his workbench. 2 revolvers lay partially disassembled, their parts modified with subtle improvements only a master gunsmith would recognize. Next to them sat a gun belt, the leather darkened and treated to prevent reflection, with holsters custom angled for a specific draw. In a hidden corner of his workshop, behind a false panel he'd installed years ago, Sullivan had opened an old trunk. Inside lay the remnants of another life. Newspaper clippings about the Iron Gunner's exploits, wanted posters that never quite got his face right, and a small tin-type photograph of a younger man standing proudly in front of a gunsmith's shop in New Mexico. But it was what lay beneath these memories that truly mattered. Martha Webb, concerned by the continued darkness of Sullivan's shop, gathered her courage and crossed the street. She'd just raised her hand to knock when the door opened. Sullivan stood there, his leather apron conspicuously absent, wearing a dark shirt that seemed to make his broad shoulders even more imposing. "Shop's closed today, Miss Martha," he said quietly. She noticed his hands, clean of forge grime for the first time she could remember, the calluses telling a different story in the morning light. "Tom," she started, then hesitated. "Those men, the Hawkins gang, they're saying terrible things about what they're going to do to the town, to anyone who stands against them." Sullivan's eyes, usually so carefully neutral, held something that made her breath catch, a cold certainty that reminded her of winter storms rolling down from the mountains. "Best stay home today," he advised. "Keep your doors locked, whatever you hear." As Martha hurried back to her store, more riders were arriving in town, hard men drawn by the Hawkins gang's reputation, swelling their numbers past 20. They thought they were gathering for easy profit, for the chance to help carve out a new criminal empire in the Wyoming Territory. None of them realized they were actually attending their own funeral. In his workshop, Thomas Sullivan began preparing for a very different kind of forging, one that would reshape not steel, but the future of Millstone Creek itself. The Iron Gunner was about to remind the world why some legends are best left undisturbed. By mid-morning, Millstone Creek had taken on the atmosphere of a town under siege. The Hawkins gang's collection crews moved methodically from business to business, their requests for protection money backed by casual displays of violence. At the general store, Snake-Eye Jenkins made his point by shooting holes in Martha Webb's finest china. At the doctor's office, El Coyote simply cleaned his knife while discussing the unfortunate frequency of medical accidents. Sheriff Cooper, watching helplessly from his office, counted over 25 outlaws now. Each hour brought more riders, drawn by the prospect of easy money and the chance to be part of something bigger. The Hawkins gang wasn't just taking over a town. They were building an empire. Matthew Hawkins, ever the strategist, had positioned men at key points throughout Millstone Creek. 2 watched the telegraph office, ensuring no messages for help could be sent. Others monitored the main roads, tracking everyone entering or leaving town. It was a masterclass in territorial control, the kind of operation that had already brought 3 other towns under the gang's brutal dominion. In his private room above the saloon, Marcus Hawkins was meeting with his brothers, discussing their next move. "Sullivan's shop is key," he explained, pouring himself a drink. "Town this size, everyone depends on the blacksmith. Control him, we control their livelihood." Luke, still nursing both a hangover and wounded pride from the previous night, spat on the floor. "Man's got spine. I'll give him that. Might need to show him what happened to the last folk who stood against us." But Matthew shook his head. "Something ain't right about him. Way he moves, way he watches everything. Reminds me of stories I heard about that ghost from New Mexico, the one they called the Iron." "Ghost stories?" Marcus interrupted sharply. "That's all they were. Iron Gunner died years ago in that mess at Bitter Creek. Everybody knows that." Meanwhile, at the edge of town, an old Mexican vaquero named Diego Ramirez was leading his horse into Sullivan's workshop. Unlike the other townspeople, who now hurried through the streets with downcast eyes, Diego walked with the confident stride of a man unafraid of shadows. "Been a long time, amigo," he said softly as Sullivan closed the door behind him. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd need these again." He began unpacking his saddlebags, revealing boxes of ammunition. Not common rounds, but custom-made cartridges crafted to exact specifications. Sullivan's eyes narrowed. "How'd you know?" Diego's weathered face creased in a smile. "Word travels. When I heard the Hawkins gang was moving in on Millstone Creek, I knew." He patted his horse's neck. "Rode 3 days straight. Figured the Iron Gunner might need his special shells." "That name died at Bitter Creek," Sullivan said quietly, but his hands were already checking the ammunition with expert precision. "Did it?" Diego watched his old friend work. "You know what they still say in New Mexico? Devil takes wicked men, but the Iron Gunner? He takes the ones even the devil won't touch." Outside, the summer heat had turned the town's main street into a shimmering mirage. Luke Hawkins, determined to reassert his authority after the previous night's embarrassment, was leading another collection crew toward Sullivan's shop. This time, he'd brought 5 men with him. In his office, Sheriff Cooper saw them coming. His hand moved to his gun, but he knew trying to stop them would only get him killed. Instead, he wrote quickly in his journal. "It's strange, watching a storm gather. You see the clouds, feel the wind change, know something's coming. But it's only when the first lightning strikes that you realize just how bad it's going to be." Inside his workshop, Sullivan heard them coming. He shared a look with Diego, who nodded grimly, and moved to the back of the shop, where he had a clear view of both doors. The old vaquero's hands, gnarled from years of roping cattle, now rested comfortably on the worn grips of his twin Remingtons. The heavy tread of boots approached Sullivan's door. The Iron Gunner's legend was about to be reborn in blood and gunsmoke, and Millstone Creek would never be the same. Luke Hawkins kicked open Sullivan's door with all the subtlety of a wounded bear. Flanked by his 5 men, he swaggered into the workshop, the previous night's whiskey replaced by liquid courage of a darker vintage. The shop's interior was different now, work tables cleared, tools arranged with deliberate precision, the forge cold and silent. "Thought about our offer?" Luke called out, his voice echoing in the unnaturally quiet space. His men spread out, unconsciously positioning themselves like wolves surrounding prey. Brother Marcus, he ain't known for his patience. Sullivan stood at his workbench, his broad back turned to the intruders. His hands moved steadily over something they couldn't quite see. "Shop's closed," he said quietly, his voice carrying that same deadly calm from the night before. "Ain't gonna be open much longer at all," one of Luke's men sneered, running his hand along a rack of carefully arranged hammers. "'Less you wise up and take the boss's deal." In the shadows at the back of the shop, Diego remained perfectly still, years of experience telling him the exact moment to move would come. He watched Sullivan's hands, recognizing the familiar rhythm of a man checking his weapons one final time. "5 minutes, Sullivan said, still not turning around. "Leave now, right out of town. Won't be another warning." Luke's laugh was ugly. "Or what? You'll hammer us to death," he drew his gun with practiced speed. "Turn around, old man, want you to see what's coming." Sullivan's movements were unhurried as he finally faced them. Something in his eyes made 2 of Luke's men take involuntary steps backward. Even Luke's cocky grin faltered slightly. "Always wondered," Sullivan said softly, "why men like you mistake silence for weakness." His massive hands, which had spent years shaping metal to his will, were empty at his sides. "Why you think a man who chooses peace has forgotten war?" "Enough talk," Luke snarled, raising his gun. "Time to—" What happened next would be discussed in whispers throughout the territory for years to come. Sullivan's movement was like summer lightning, there and gone before the eye could track it. 2 revolvers seemed to materialize in his hands, their steel darker than normal gunmetal, their grips worn to the exact shape of his palms. Luke managed to squeeze off one shot, the bullet sparking off a forge hammer as Sullivan flowed aside like smoke in a wind. The iron gunner's return fire was devastatingly precise, one shot to Luke's gun hand destroying both weapon and fingers, another to his shoulder that spun him like a top. Diego's Remington spoke from the shadows, dropping 2 more outlaws before they could clear leather. The remaining 3 managed to draw, but they were shooting at a legend now. Sullivan moved through his workshop like a ghost through a graveyard, each step placing him exactly where he needed to be, each shot finding its mark with surgical precision. The gunfight lasted less than 10 seconds. When the smoke cleared, 5 of Luke's men lay groaning on the floor, each precisely wounded to disable without killing. Luke himself knelt in a growing pool of his own blood, staring up at Sullivan with eyes wide with recognition and terror. "You," he gasped. "You're him. The iron—" "Was," Sullivan corrected quietly, his custom revolvers disappearing as smoothly as they'd appeared. "Now I'm just a blacksmith." He looked at Diego. "Get word to Doc Matthews. Tell him he's got patients coming." Outside, the gunfire had drawn a crowd. Marcus and Matthew Hawkins stood in front of the saloon, watching as their wounded men were carried from Sullivan's shop. Sheriff Cooper, observing from his office, quickly wrote in his journal, "Funny thing about reputations. They're like shadows, longest at dawn and dusk, but always there, even in the brightest noon. Some men spend years running from theirs, until the day comes when they have to step back into it, like a gunfighter strapping on his old rig." The war for Millstone Creek had just begun, and the opening shot had been fired by a ghost everyone thought was dead. Marcus Hawkins stood in Doc Matthews' makeshift hospital, watching as the physician worked on his brother Luke's shattered hand. The young outlaw's face was pale from blood loss and laudanum, but his eyes burned with humiliation and rage. "Iron gunner," Luke mumbled through pain-gritted teeth. "Should have known. Way he moved. Way he handled those guns." Marcus's face remained stone still, but his fingers drummed an agitated rhythm on his gun belt. 6 men, all experienced shootists taken apart like greenhorns in their first gunfight. The implications were troubling. "El Coyote," he called to the Mexican gunman lurking in the doorway. "What do you know about this iron gunner?" The pistolero crossed himself before answering. In New Mexico, they say he was a gunsmith first, made weapons better than any man alive. But after some tragedy, stories differ on what, he became something else, a ghost who hunted evil men. El Coyote's voice dropped lower. They say he never killed unless he had to, but when he did... Matthew Hawkins interrupted, entering with a telegram in his hand. Wire from Carson City. Got a response about Sullivan's description. He handed the paper to his brother. Matches a gunsmith who disappeared after the Bitter Creek massacre 5 years ago. Same man who tracked down the Bolton gang one by one. Marcus read the telegram, his expression darkening. Says here he killed Wade Bolton with a shot at 800 yards, using a gun he'd made himself. 15 men, El Coyote added quietly. That's how many the Bolton gang lost before they finally caught him at Bitter Creek. Burned down his shop with him inside. Everyone thought he was dead. In his workshop, Sullivan and Diego were having their own conversation while cleaning their weapons. The old vaquero watched his friend's methodical movements with knowing eyes. They'll come harder next time, Diego warned. Marcus Hawkins didn't build his reputation by backing down. Sullivan nodded, checking the sight alignment on one of his custom revolvers. Town's full of their men now. More coming. His massive hands moved with surgical precision over the gun's mechanism. Need to thin them out, make them remember what fear tastes like. At the saloon, Marcus was already planning his response. 20 hardened gunmen gathered around as he laid out his strategy. Sullivan's dangerous in that shop, knows every corner, every shadow, so we burn it down, tonight, with him in it. But Matthew, ever the cautious one, raised an objection. What if that's what he expects? Man fought the Bolton gang solo. He'll have preparations, backup plans. Then we burn the whole damn town, Marcus snarled. Every building, every business, until he has nowhere left to hide. See how well he shoots when everything he's trying to protect is ash. In his office, Sheriff Cooper was writing again. Strange how destiny works. 5 years Sullivan spent building a peaceful life, turning iron into tools instead of weapons. But some men are like the steel they work with. You can reshape them, try to make them soft, but the hard core never truly goes away. When the hammer falls, their true nature shows through. Martha Webb, bringing coffee to the sheriff's office, paused to watch Sullivan's shop through the window. The blacksmith was working again, the ring of his hammer echoing down the street. But the rhythm was different now, more purposeful, like a smith forging not horseshoes but bullets. Never seen him like this, she whispered. All these years he was so quiet, so gentle. Cooper smiled grimly. Some men choose peace not because they're weak, Martha, but because they know exactly how good they are at war. As evening approached, tension grew thick as forge smoke over Millstone Creek. Marcus Hawkins's men made their preparations, gathering oil and timber for their night's work. But in his workshop, the iron gunner was preparing too, and this time, he wouldn't be caught unaware like at Bitter Creek. The night would indeed bring fire, but not the kind Marcus Hawkins was expecting. Before we dive back into our tale, make sure you're subscribed. The coming confrontation is something you won't want to miss. Now, let's return to Millstone Creek as darkness falls. Sunset painted the town in shades of blood and shadow, the kind of evening that old-timers said preceded violence. Marcus Hawkins had gathered 30 men for the night's work, splitting them into teams with military precision. Some carried torches and oil cans, others positioned themselves on rooftops with rifles, creating overlapping fields of fire that would turn the streets into killing grounds. Remember, Marcus instructed his men, when the shooting starts, nobody approaches Sullivan's shop directly. Man's deadlier than a rattler in his den. We contain him. Let the fire do the work. He turned to El Coyote. Your men ready on the north side? The Mexican gunman nodded grimly. Si, Jefe. But something feels wrong. Town's too quiet. He was right. As darkness settled over Millstone Creek, an unnatural stillness had fallen. No piano music drifted from the saloon. No voices carried on the evening air. Even the usual street dogs had gone silent, as if the very animals sensed the coming storm. In his office, Sheriff Cooper made one last entry in his journal. Funny thing about fires, they need 3 things to burn: fuel, air, and a spark. Marcus Hawkins thinks he's bringing all 3. What he doesn't know is that Sullivan's been laying his own fuel for hours, just waiting for the right moment to strike the match. Diego, watching from the shadow of the livery stable, saw the careful way Sullivan had prepared the battlefield. Certain alleys had been subtly blocked, forcing movement along predictable paths. Barrels had been strategically positioned, their contents unknown, but surely deadly. The old vaquero smiled, remembering similar preparations from their days hunting the Bolton gang. Martha Webb, huddled in her store's back room with other townspeople, jumped at every sound. Through a gap in the shutters, she could see men moving in the growing darkness, positioning themselves like pieces in some deadly game of chess. "Should have sent for the marshal," someone whispered. "Wouldn't have made it in time," another voice answered. "Besides, way I hear it, the iron gunner's worth 10 marshals." In his workshop, Sullivan completed his final preparations. His custom revolvers, each a masterpiece of engineering, rested in their specially designed holsters. Additional weapons had been positioned throughout the building. Not just guns, but tools of his trade repurposed for war. Even the forge itself had been prepared, though not in any way Marcus Hawkins would expect. "Just like Bitter Creek," Diego said softly, slipping in through the back door. "Except this time, we're ready for them." Sullivan nodded, checking the primitive timing device he'd constructed from clockwork parts. "They'll hit at midnight. Figure the town will be deepest asleep then." "Town, maybe," Diego grinned, the expression wolf-like in the dim light. "But not us old ghosts." Outside, Matthew Hawkins was growing increasingly uneasy. Something about the situation felt wrong, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "Marcus," he called, softly, to his brother. "Man like Sullivan, he has to know we're coming. Why isn't he trying to leave?" "Because he's stubborn," Marcus replied, but doubt crept into his voice. "Or stupid. Or waiting," Matthew muttered, but too quietly for anyone to hear. The moon rose over the Medicine Bow Mountains, casting strange shadows across Millstone Creek's empty streets. In those shadows, death waited patiently, wearing the form of a simple blacksmith who'd tried to leave his violent past behind. But as Marcus Hawkins was about to learn, some fires once lit never truly go out. They just wait beneath the ashes, ready to explode back to life at the slightest breath of wind. The stage was set. In less than an hour, Marcus Hawkins would give the order that would transform Millstone Creek into a battlefield. But he still didn't understand the fundamental truth that smarter men had learned too late. You can't burn a ghost, and the Iron Gunner was about to remind the world why that name had once made even the boldest outlaws tremble. Midnight approached Millstone Creek like a hangman walking toward a condemned man. The moon had risen high enough to cast sharp shadows across the town's empty streets, each one a potential hiding place for death. Marcus Hawkins raised his hand, preparing to give the signal that would start the inferno. That's when the first part of Sullivan's plan revealed itself. The explosion took everyone by surprise. One of the strategic barrels he'd positioned earlier burst with devastating force, spraying a mixture of forge powder and metal shavings across the street. 2 of Hawkins's men went down screaming, their faces peppered with burning fragments. Before anyone could react, 2 more explosions rocked the night, cutting off prepared escape routes. "He's boxing us in," Matthew Hawkins shouted, but his voice was drowned out by more detonations. The carefully planned attack was rapidly descending into chaos. In his workshop, Sullivan stood calmly in the darkness, Diego at his side. Through the windows, they could see Marcus's men scrambling for cover, their formations broken, their careful planning shattered. "Just like you said," Diego observed. "Predictable as cattle in a storm." Sullivan's only response was to draw his custom revolvers, the metalwork so dark it seemed to swallow moonlight. When he spoke, his voice carried that same quiet certainty that had marked his days as the Iron Gunner. Time to remind them why they used to fear the dark. On the street, Marcus Hawkins was trying to regain control of the situation. "Form up," he shouted. "Don't let him—" His words cut off as a shot rang out from an impossible angle, taking his hat off as cleanly as a barber's razor. A second shot shattered the oil lantern he was holding, spilling burning fuel across the ground. El Coyote, who'd survived a dozen gunfights through sheer cunning, suddenly understood. He's not trapped in there, the Mexican gunman realized aloud. We're trapped out here. Sullivan moved through his workshop like a ghost through a graveyard, each step placed with deadly precision. The iron gunner's legend hadn't been built on speed alone, but on an almost supernatural ability to appear where he wasn't expected. Now he put those skills to lethal use. A rifle barrel appeared in a window. Sullivan's first shot bent it like a pretzel. His second took the shooter in the shoulder. Two men tried rushing the back door. Diego's Remingtons spoke from the shadows, dropping them both with leg wounds. Every attack was met with precise, disabling fire, until the street was littered with groaning outlaws. "Burn it," Marcus screamed, his carefully laid plans falling apart. "Burn everything." Some of his men tried to comply, throwing torches at the workshop's walls, but Sullivan had prepared for this too. The walls had been soaked with water, and strategically placed forge bellows created winds that blew the flames back at the attackers. The night filled with curses and screams as Hawkins's own men were caught in their backfiring attack. Sheriff Cooper, watching from his office window, couldn't help but smile. "Like trying to burn down a fortress," he wrote in his journal. "Except this fortress shoots back." Matthew Hawkins, always the tactician, saw the trap too late. Sullivan hadn't fortified his workshop to keep them out. He'd turned the entire town into a killing ground, using their own tactics against them. Every alley they might use for cover had been pre-sighted. Every escape route channeled them exactly where the iron gunner wanted them. "Marcus," Matthew shouted to his brother, "we need to pull back, regroup." But Marcus Hawkins had passed the point of reason. The humiliation of having his plans so thoroughly countered had pushed him into a rage. "Keep pushing," he ordered. "He can't shoot all of us." An answering shot split the night, so precise it cut Marcus's gun belt clean off his hips. The gang leader's prized Colt fell into the dirt, its handle shattered by the same bullet. A voice drifted out of the darkness, quiet as a prairie breeze but carrying to every ear. "Want to test that theory?" The night had transformed Millstone Creek into something from a fever dream. Smoke from Sullivan's defensive explosions drifted through the streets like phantom riders. Wounded men groaned in the darkness, their bodies scattered across the battlefield like pieces on a chessboard, each one placed exactly where the iron gunner had intended. Marcus Hawkins stood in the middle of the street, staring at his shattered gun belt in disbelief. In 15 years of outlawry, no one had ever stripped him of his weapon so precisely, so humiliatingly. His face twisted with rage as he snatched up a rifle from a fallen man. "Show yourself," he roared into the smoke-filled night. "Face me like a man." A quiet voice answered from everywhere and nowhere. "Tried being a man. Tried living peaceful. You brought the ghost back." Another shot cracked through the darkness, splitting the rifle's barrel as cleanly as a butcher's cleaver through bone. "Now live with the consequences." El Coyote, who had survived this long by knowing when the odds were hopeless, began backing away. "Diablo," he muttered, crossing himself. "No man shoots like that. No man." In his workshop, Sullivan moved like smoke between firing positions, each one carefully prepared during the day's work. Diego covered the rear approaches, his Remingtons barking short, precise messages to any outlaws trying to flank their position. The old vaquero grinned in the darkness. It felt like the old days when the iron gunner's legend was first being written in gun smoke and blood. Matthew Hawkins, trying to organize some kind of defense, watched in growing horror as Sullivan's strategy revealed itself. The explosions hadn't just been for show. They'd herded the gang into killing zones, each one pre-sighted and prepared. Every time his men tried to group up or establish a firing line, precise shots would scatter them like quail before a hunting dog. He's not trying to kill us, Matthew realized aloud. He's breaking us, teaching us fear. At the doctor's office, Luke Hawkins lay in his laudanum haze, listening to the gunfire outside. Each shot brought back memories of those terrible moments in Sullivan's shop, of movement faster than human eyes could track, of bullets that seemed guided by an otherworldly hand. Should have listened, he mumbled to no one in particular. Should have left when he warned us. Sheriff Cooper, still documenting everything from his office window, wrote quickly in his journal. Watching Sullivan work is like seeing a master craftsman at his forge. Every shot, every movement shaped and planned like he was forging steel. The Iron Gunner isn't just fighting the Hawkins gang. He's reminding the territory why some legends are best left to rest. Marcus, his authority crumbling like sand in a desert wind, made one last desperate attempt to salvage the night. $50 to the man who puts a bullet in him, he shouted. 100 to whoever burns that shop. The answer came in a demonstration that would be whispered about in saloons for years to come. 5 shots rang out in rapid succession, so close together they sounded like a single rolling thunderclap. 5 outlaws found themselves disarmed, their guns shattered in their hands. A 6th shot blew Marcus's hat off again, this time pinning it to the saloon wall. That's 1 cylinder, Sullivan's voice drifted from the smoke. Got 5 more. Sure you want to keep counting? The gang's resolve, already cracking, finally shattered. Men began running, no longer caring about Marcus's orders or promised rewards. They'd come expecting to burn out a simple blacksmith. Instead, they'd awakened something from the darkest pages of frontier legend. Diego, watching the outlaws flee into the night, shook his head with grim amusement. They never learn, do they? Trying to burn a ghost. But Sullivan knew the night wasn't over. Marcus Hawkins still stood in the street, his face twisted with a rage that had transcended fear. Behind him, Matthew watched with growing dread, recognizing the look in his brother's eyes. The same look he'd worn before ordering the massacre at Silver Springs. The real blood was yet to be spilled, and the Iron Gunner's legend was about to add another chapter written in gunsmoke and vengeance. Before we continue our tale, if you're riveted by this story of justice and redemption, make sure you're subscribed. Now, let's return to that fateful night in Millstone Creek, where legends were being reforged in blood and gunsmoke. Marcus Hawkins stood alone in the street, his men either fallen or fled, his carefully constructed plan in ruins around him. The smoke from Sullivan's explosive traps had begun to clear, revealing the full extent of the Iron Gunner's handiwork. Over 20 men wounded with surgical precision, their weapons shattered, their spirits broken. "Come out, Sullivan!" Marcus bellowed, his voice cracking with desperate rage. "Or should I say Iron Gunner? Face me straight up. Or are you only brave in the shadows?" Matthew Hawkins tried to grab his brother's arm. "Marcus, it's over. We need to—" "It's not over," Marcus snarled, shrugging off Matthew's grip. "Not while I'm breathing." He turned toward the silent workshop, where lamplight now glowed softly through the windows. "You hear me, Ghost? I've got something that might interest you. Something about Bitter Creek." Inside the workshop, Sullivan went perfectly still. Diego, who'd known him longer than most, saw the change come over his friend, like watching a banked fire roar suddenly to life. "Tom," Diego said softly, using the name he hadn't spoken in years. "He's baiting you." "I know." Sullivan checked his revolvers with mechanical precision. "But some baits need taking." Marcus's voice carried through the night again. "Ever wonder who really burned your shop that day? Who paid the Bolton gang to hit you? 5 years you've been hiding, playing at peace when the man responsible was out here living free." Sheriff Cooper, still watching from his office, wrote quickly. "Strange how the past never stays buried. Like iron in the ground, it rusts but doesn't rot, waiting for someone to dig it up and forge it into something deadly." Sullivan appeared in his doorway like a spirit materializing from smoke. His custom revolvers hung at his sides, their dark metal seeming to drink in the moonlight. The simple blacksmith was gone. In his place stood the legend that had hunted evil men across the territories, dealing justice one precisely placed bullet at a time. Talk, Sullivan said quietly, his voice carrying across the now silent street. Marcus's face split in a savage grin. Oh, I'll talk. About how Wade Bolton came to me first, looking to set up his gang in my territory. How I told him about this troublesome gunsmith who kept arming lawmen with weapons that were too good, too accurate. How much I paid him to burn you out. Matthew Hawkins felt his blood run cold. In all their years riding together, he'd never known this secret, never guessed his brother's connection to one of the territory's most notorious massacres. Sullivan's expression hadn't changed, but something shifted in his eyes, something that made even Marcus's desperate bravado falter slightly. All these years, Sullivan said softly, thought I'd hunted down everyone responsible. Missed one. And now you know. Marcus laughed, the sound edged with madness. So, come on, Ghost. Let's finish what started at Bitter Creek. El Coyote, watching from the shadows, saw what Marcus had missed. The gang leader thought he was provoking Sullivan into a rage, trying to make him careless. Instead, he'd simply given the iron gunner something he'd been seeking for 5 years, a reason to stop holding back. Last chance, Sullivan said, his voice quiet as a prairie breeze. Surrender to the sheriff. Face territory justice. Marcus's response was to draw a hidden derringer from his sleeve, the small gun glinting in the moonlight. Already chose my justice, he snarled. Time to send another ghost to hell. The street held its breath. In his office, Sheriff Cooper set down his pen, knowing he was about to witness something that would be talked about for generations. Diego whispered a quiet prayer in Spanish, not for his friend, but for those who had finally pushed him past the point of mercy. The iron gunner was about to remind the territory that some legends don't grow in the telling. They get watered down, made safer for the telling. And the truth, when it finally shows itself, is far more terrifying than any story. What happened next would be debated in saloons across the territory for years to come. Some said Sullivan moved faster than human eyes could track. Others swore he'd somehow bent the moonlight itself around him. But all agreed on one thing. They'd witnessed something beyond ordinary human skill. Marcus's derringer barked twice, the shots echoing off the buildings like thunder. But Sullivan was no longer where he'd been standing. He seemed to flow like water around the bullets, his own guns appearing in his hands, as if conjured from thin air. Their report was different from ordinary revolvers, deeper, more authoritative, like the voice of judgment itself. Time seemed to slow as the iron gunner demonstrated why his legend had once terrorized the worst elements of the frontier. His first shot took Marcus's derringer, transforming the small gun into spinning shards of metal. The second bullet threaded the space between Marcus's arm and body, so precise it cut his gun belt's spare holster free without breaking skin. Impossible, Matthew breathed, watching his brother's weapons stripped away with surgical precision. No one can shoot like that. But Sullivan wasn't finished. His third shot knocked Marcus's boot heel off, destroying another hidden derringer before the gang leader could reach for it. The fourth bullet shattered a knife hilt protruding from Marcus's sleeve. Each shot demonstrated a level of skill that transformed violence into art, gunfighting into surgery. "You've got one left," Sullivan said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the stunned silence. "The knife in your collar." "Don't—" Marcus, his face twisted with desperate fury, went for it anyway. The blade had barely cleared leather when Sullivan's fifth shot took it from his hand, the metal ringing as it spiraled away into the darkness. The iron gunner's final bullet kicked up dirt between Marcus's feet, a clear message that every previous shot had been exactly where Sullivan wanted it. "At Bitter Creek," Sullivan said, his guns still trained on Marcus with rock-steady hands, "you burned my home. Destroyed my life's work. Thought you'd killed the man I was." He took a step forward, moonlight catching the ancient pain in his eyes. "Instead, you created something worse. A ghost who spent 2 years hunting every member of the Bolton gang, teaching them the difference between fear and terror." Sheriff Cooper, who'd moved to the street during the exchange, found himself holding his breath. In 15 years of law work, he'd never seen shooting like this, not just accurate but precise in a way that spoke of superhuman skill. Should have made sure I was dead, Sullivan continued, his voice still carrying that deadly quiet. Because I've spent 5 years trying to forget what I was, trying to be just a blacksmith again. Another step forward, his guns never wavering. But you had to push, had to remind me, had to make me remember. Marcus, stripped of weapons and bravado, finally showed real fear. Do it then, he snarled, though his voice shook. Finish it. That's the difference between us, Sullivan replied. You burn everything you touch, leave nothing but ashes. His guns disappeared as smoothly as they'd appeared. I fix things, forge them stronger. He turned to Sheriff Cooper. He's yours, James. Everything you need to know about Silver Springs, Apache Wells, and 3 other massacres. He just confessed to ordering all of them. El Coyote, watching from the shadows, crossed himself again. The iron gunner's reputation had always said he could shoot the flame off a candle at 50 paces. Now the Mexican gunman knew those stories hadn't been exaggerated. They'd been watered down to make them believable. As Cooper moved to take Marcus into custody, Matthew Hawkins stared at Sullivan with a mixture of awe and terror. You could have killed him at any time. Could have killed all of you, Sullivan agreed quietly. Chose not to. That's what makes me different from men like your brother. I don't kill unless I have to. His eyes met Matthew's. Remember that, if you're ever thinking of coming back. The night had grown old, its darkness beginning to fade toward dawn. In his workshop, Sullivan's forge waited patiently, ready to resume its peaceful work. But everyone who witnessed that night knew they'd seen something rare, a legend proving itself true, and somehow more terrifying than any story ever told about it. Dawn broke over Millstone Creek like a fever finally breaking, the first rays of sunlight revealing the full extent of the previous night's events. Dr. Matthews had his hands full treating the wounded. Over 20 men, each bearing the precise marks of the iron gunner's work. Not one injury was fatal, but every wound told the same story of supernatural accuracy and deliberate mercy. The territorial marshal arrived with the morning stage, summoned by Sheriff Cooper's earlier telegrams. He found Marcus Hawkins securely locked in the jail, a broken man muttering about impossible shots and ghosts from the past. His confession to orchestrating the Bitter Creek massacre and numerous other crimes would eventually earn him a date with the gallows in Cheyenne. Never seen anything like it, Cooper told the marshal, gesturing at the shattered weapons littering the street. Man shot like he had some sort of arrangement with God himself, or maybe the devil. The marshal, examining a gun barrel split perfectly down the middle by one of Sullivan's bullets, shook his head in wonder. Stories about the iron gunner, always thought they were exaggerated. Now I'm thinking maybe they were toned down to make them believable. In his workshop, Sullivan had already returned to his forge. The rhythmic ring of his hammer filled the morning air, as if the events of the night had been nothing but a dream. But those who looked closely might notice subtle changes. The way his tools were arranged now spoke of both peacetime work and readiness for war, a reminder that some skills never truly fade. Martha Webb, bringing him coffee as she'd done every morning for 5 years, found the courage to speak what everyone was thinking. Will you stay, Mr. Sullivan? Now that people know? Sullivan's massive hands didn't pause in their work as he shaped glowing metal on his anvil. Town needs a blacksmith, he said quietly. That's all I aim to be. But Diego, preparing to ride south again, knew better. The territory will remember this night, he told his old friend. Word will spread. Other men like Hawkins might come, looking to make a name. Sullivan nodded slowly. Let them come. They'll find a blacksmith working his forge. His eyes met Diego's. And if they push too hard, they'll find what Marcus found. Some steel gets stronger after going through fire. Matthew Hawkins rode out that afternoon, having declined Cooper's offer of arrest. The sheriff, showing wisdom earned through years of frontier law work, recognized that Matthew's crimes had been his brother's doing. The younger Hawkins paused at the edge of town, looking back at Sullivan's shop. My pa used to say some men are like wild wolves, he told Cooper, who'd ridden out to see him off. But Sullivan, he's more like one of them old wolf dogs. Chooses to be peaceful, to serve. But push him too far. He shook his head. Anyway, you won't see me in these parts again. The town began returning to normal, though normal had taken on a new meaning. Sullivan's shop remained as busy as ever, but customers noticed their blacksmith had gained an almost mystical reputation. Travelers would detour for miles just to have him shoe their horses or repair their tools, each hoping to catch a glimpse of the legend beneath the smith's apron. Sheriff Cooper made one final entry in his journal about the affair. Funny thing about legends, most grow bigger than the truth. But sometimes, rarely, you find one that's been growing smaller trying to hide. Sullivan's legend as the Iron Gunner grew from truth, then faded into myth. But myths, like the steel he works, can be reforged when needed. Millstone Creek sleeps safer now, knowing our blacksmith is more than he appears. And if trouble comes calling again, well, some fires are best left undisturbed. In his workshop, Sullivan continued his daily routine, choosing peace but remaining ready for war. His custom revolvers rested in their hidden compartment, 6 shots spent the night before, now cleaned and loaded again. Just in case. The Iron Gunner's legend had been reborn, but on his own terms this time, not as a vengeful ghost, but as a guardian who chose to serve his community with hammer and tongs, keeping his deadlier skills sheathed but sharp. The territory would remember the night the Hawkins gang learned why some legends are best left alone. And if other trouble came to Millstone Creek, they would find what Marcus discovered, that the most dangerous predator isn't the one that hunts and howls, but the one that waits patiently, watching from behind the glow of a peaceful forge, ready to remind the world that some steel never loses its edge. Thanks for riding with us on this journey through legend and justice. If you enjoyed this tale of the Iron Gunner, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We've got more stories of frontier justice coming your way that you won't want to miss.